Ladies and gentlemen, living and undead, I would like to formally introduce you to the first meeting of Colonial branch of Archivists Guild. Before we start though, I would like to also thank you for going through with plan of our Grandmaster. I am aware that for many of you, sudden move from the continent all the way across the ocean was a very daunting move, but know that thanks to your efforts, our understanding of the world may increase 100-fold. For this place, this star-forsaken archipelago seems to hold great many secrets that may yet throw our understanding of history out of the window. But I see that some of our new archivists seem confused by that sentence, and there is little wonder in that. After all, the history has already happened, so why would we not know it, right? Sadly though, in our world and in our circumstances, our past remains just as mysterious as our future, or perhaps even more, for we can walk to make our future ourselves, while when it comes to the past we only have relations of those who came before us. Elves, the original inhabitants of this world, and, at least according to themselves, creators of all other races that inhabit it. And while times of ancient elven empire are long past, the truth is that their relations remain unreliable at best, not to mention that most of their records were destroyed in the chaos of the Awakening. But as much as these records are not reliable, they are all we have, so let us begin with them. And perhaps by exploring these islands we will be able to finally either confirm or discard them, and in doing so better understand where we come from. So, let us start from the beginning. According to elven legends, in the beginning there was perfection. Two beings so pure and so magnificent that their very appearance turned this world from a desolate wasteland into a garden springing with life that it is today. These beings were the Golden Sun and the Silver Daughter, names that you surely know, for our own two moons have been named after them. Regardless though, these two perfect entities made this place their own, and created a race of elves in their image. They teach their children their ways and made them always strive to achieve absolute best, no matter how difficult and dangerous the road ahead may be. They teach them architecture, agriculture, metallurgy and magic, and then guided them until the whole world became theirs, although, as we know today, that was not necessarily true. Still, generation after generation of elves walked and expanded their reach around the world until they created the greatest nation to ever exist, the Empire, which, in a way, continues existence to this day, even though its creators are no longer here. And as their domain expanded, so did their understanding of this world, and soon first elven mages outgrew their original creators, long dead and decayed by then, and named themselves Sorcerer Kings. If legends and scattered historical records are to be believed, these beings could wield magic that to us would seem unthinkable, magic that could make or unmake continents and even change the flow of time. Most importantly though, the sorcerers could create life, and so they did, hoping to create other intelligent beings that would be subservient to elves and work as their servants, while their overlords and creators could enjoy lives of peace and prosperity. The first creation, the goblins, turn out to be flawed, at least in the eyes of elven kings. They possessed extreme endurance and adaptability and highly developed intelligence, but to their creators all that meant nothing, for they were not aesthetically pleasing. And so the goblins were cast down to walk in mines and farms, far, far away from their creators as to not offend them. And later, in a move that changed history forever, they were sent out beyond the Empire to prepare other lands for their masters, and it was there where they managed to break free their shackled minds and established republics we know today. For by being so far away from Sorcerer Kings, they could finally act and think independently, without fear of fierce and bloody punishment. Meanwhile, the kings continued their experiments and rituals, hoping to perfect their life-creating spells and make beings truly worthy of serving them. They created orcs, which were perfectly suited for manual labor and warfare thanks to their great strength and endurance. They created dwarves to facilitate trade and replaced goblins who toiled in the mines and forges. And, interestingly enough, the dwarves also replaced many of the elves when it came to nautical voyages, as the small beings turn out to be almost instinctively drawn towards the sea. Then, in an experiment gone wrong, the group of Sorcerer Kings created halflings, a mistake so grave that it haunts the world to this very day. Somehow, through some bizarre twist of fate, this new race took only the worst qualities from their masters. Their gluttony, their megalomaniacal pride, their bloodthirsty, envious ambition, and their unquenchable greed. All that was packed into small, frail beings who, despite being cast out and hunted down for thousands of years, still somehow managed to survive and thrive and, in the end, outlasted their masters. But then, finally, the sorcerers created beings that aesthetically were as close as they could be to the perfect template of the elves. Humans. And although they lacked strength of orcs, resilience of goblins, and smarts of dwarves, they were nonetheless chosen to become proper race of servants, one that could walk alongside their elven masters without covering their bodies to not offend them with their appearance. And for hundreds, or perhaps thousands or even more years, they have done so. The Empire used its new servants of all races to become a truly utopian place to live, at least for the elves. Life was so great that the original plan of colonizing the continent to the south was scrapped. Only a handful of elves were sent there, but they were mostly outcasts, criminals and rebels, exiled from their glorious motherland and forbidden to ever return. One day, these elves would found the Emerald Council, and although they began as exiles, in the end they had the last laugh and managed to outlast those who cast them out. But while the Empire prospered, the goblins did so as well, in their own unique fashion. Day after day their numbers grew, and so did their dominion over the continent they were sent to prepare for their masters. Forests, valleys and mountains were tamed, cities were built, rivers rerouted, all with sheer, near limitless manpower that only goblins could provide. After a while, other races appeared, aside from already mentioned elven exiles, and joined the efforts. Humans, dwarves, orcs, and even some halflings were either sent south by sorcerer kings or fled there themselves, looking for a life free of servitude. They would one day form nations like Kingdom of Southern, but back then they all stuck together, hoping to carve little freedom for themselves. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and in the time of all-powerful sorcerer kings, no one even dared to hope about true freedom for everyone. No one, except for a small group of goblin engineers who, on one fateful day, realized that the power of various minerals extracted from the ground can rival or even outmatch the one wielded by sorcerer kings. These goblins would then perish in a massive explosion that leveled half of their city to the ground, but their notes remained, and amongst their notes, next to technical descriptions, was their dream, the dream of awakening. And when these notes were recovered, it was only a matter of time before this dream became reality, but that is a story for another time. So then, my fellow archivists, you now know the history of this world as is told by elves, but now, with what we've learned from ruins scattered on these islands, that history may not be as truthful as we once believed in. And it is why we are here, to verify and understand it. Now then, yes, the lady with raised hand, can I help you? Yes, well, I was wondering about one thing. You say that this organization is called Archivists Guild, but all that reference material your assistants handed to us is marked with a completely different name. So, pardon my bluntness, but I just want to ask whether or not this is some kind of a scam. Ah, that, of course not. The name of our organization was simply changed in recent months after several unpleasant accidents all across the continent, and even in the Empire. For some reason, the name Order of the Curators brought up a lot of aggression in people. In the late summer of year 1140 after the Great Awakening, news about Colonial army securing, after long and hard fight, victory over Naga's occupying ruined town in the middle of the island reached the city of Metzaca, where, for a moment, they were welcomed without that much of a fuss. But then, over the course of next few days, the true meaning of this message started to sink into collective brain of the public opinion as, slowly but surely, everyone, from lowliest beggars to council members, realized what it meant. This Naga stronghold was the last bastion of dangerous hostile beings on the entire island, and now, finally, it was cleared, which meant that the entire island was secured for the first time since initial settlers set foot in Metzaca Bay. And all that happened not over the course of decades or centuries, as many expected it would, but within 3 years of Prince Arius's arrival. Initially welcomed with much reservation, the prince decided against living a safe and unremarkable life within some dusty mansion in the Cliff City, and instead threw himself into action, whipping small and uncoordinated colonial garrisons into shape and restoring order to the island that was technically his new domain. What was a small city-state those 3 years ago was now a respectable colonial power, holding 3 large settlements and dozens of smaller ones, with new villages and towns popping up all over the islands almost all the time. And now, with the island safe and secured, many Metzacan people could finally do what they came here for in the first place, and become actual colonists. Lord Governor's army was still patching up its wounded and exploring the ruins, while endless processions of carts left Metzaca, filled with people who left tensions and overpopulation of the old continent behind, and were now eager to forge new lives for themselves under Metzacan banners. But that was only a small part. Thanks to Lord Governor's actions, the colony not only managed to grow and expand its reach, it also began to prosper, with more and more wealth filling the treasury every day, as new settlements provided more taxes, while Arius's overseas escapades secured him preferential trade deals with Tigrans and dwarves of Dolsmere. And said escapades also provided the colony with something else, a single man who insisted on calling himself Arcadian the Indomitable, a disgraced member of the Artificers Guild who, despite his expulsion from the formation, was now standing in the very center of almost every single improvement project within the colony. His machines-powered mines and factories helped farmers and merchants, and were even used with much success by the military, and with every passing day Arcadian's machinery helped bring Metzaca even more coin. Markets were bursting with goods produced en masse by those machines, and said goods were then sold either locally, or, much more often, with great profit back to the continent, always hungry for more wares for its people. The colony of Metzaca and Republic of Southern might have been technical enemies, especially considering who was in charge of each one, but politics can rarely interfere with trade, and so it was not uncommon to see merchants from the new Republic sailing into Metzacan port and doing business with their former countrymen as if the revolution never happened. After all, for most people not much has changed, and so the trade flourished despite cold official relations. And yet, there was still so much more, for thanks to Arcadian's knowledge, Metzaca was able to open its own Artificers Guild, sponsored by the state and working solely to provide the government with more advanced weapons or ways to make even more gold. And although it was only a small formation for now, generous government funding allowed its inventors to quickly close technological gap that divided them from the mainland. Soon, first groups of combat engineers began their training, ready to provide their technical knowledge to Metzacan forces, while the factories located in the Forge district in the middle of the cliff were now capable of mass-producing actual muskets, far more effective than a handful of old, outdated handguns used by colonial militia. Although, by then, the militiamen were so used to their old guns and so experienced in using them that most of them decided against upgrading to new model firearms, which meant that other companies had to be raised to make use of them. And very soon, fields outside of Metzaca thundered with regular volleys of hundreds of muskets, fired by numerous eager recruits. It would still take a long time for the colony to reach the true level of technology from the continent, but the first steps were already taken and infrastructure established, and from there it was mostly a simple matter of time. Though, as Arius and his advisors would soon learn, Arcadian was not content to simply copy all the designs of his former colleagues. He had far more interesting plans in mind, and now that the island was secured, he could finally focus on bringing them into reality. But as for Arius and his men, they were not going to enjoy fruits of their labor, not yet, at least. There was still more to be done, there was always more to be done, and so as the ruins were secured, Arius turned his attention to Tigran's settlement to southwest, which recently sent yet another message. Apparently, the number of undead rampaging across the island grew so much that at this point it was impossible for most of the people there to leave their hidden town, which stifled trade and made hunts and farming almost impossible. What's more, with Tigrans unable to freely move around, many of the smaller towns and villages ended up overrun by local wildlife, which meant that it was only a matter of time before stockpiles ran out and the cat people would starve to death. And so, after a long-distance conversation with the council, made possible thanks to one of Arcadian's new gadgets, Arius managed to convince colonial politicians to approve yet another overseas expedition, and, much to his surprise, they even agreed to raise more forces to ensure victory. And although at first the prince thought that maybe the councillors were finally warming up to him, he soon realized true motives behind their actions. Trade with Tigrans was, after all, highly profitable, so having it blocked by an undead horde was not doing anyone in Metzaca any favors. And since they were not the ones to go into battle, politicians eagerly approved a mission that was bound to bring them even more coin, and so preparations started almost immediately. And while the army prepared, artificers under Arcadian's command decided to use their skills to help Metzacan cartographers. The archipelago they found themselves on was technically considered to be discovered, but in truth it was clear that no one knew for sure just how large this area even was, let alone how it looks. Thanks to Arius's expeditions, cartographers and navigators were capable to at least point out several islands, but the rest of the island chain was a complete mystery to them. But that's where Arcadian's machines came in. The same drones that patrolled the roads and were used in suicide attacks by Arius's army were now being sent in all directions to figure out the full scale of Archipelago, although for now they mostly kept to the shoreline, simply to scout out boundaries of other islands without venturing deeper inland. After all, the place was known to be dangerous, so it was wise to keep the drones away from said danger, and there certainly were quite a lot of them, as most inhabitants of the island, whether civilized or not, were not really eager to see those bloated, floating fish sailing through the air above their homes. What's more, the further the machines went, the more difficult contact with them became, and so Arcadian's operators had their hands full simply trying to keep their chargers from drifting off and crashing into some mountain or into ocean waves. But, day by day, their contributions uncovered more and more archipelago. Someday soon, the islands would have no secrets from Metzacans, who could then use that knowledge to further plan their expansion. Few months later, the time finally came for Arius and his forces to move to the south, as messages from Tigrans became more and more desperate every day. An order was sent to the fleet station in Fringit to move towards the strait that separated Metzaca from volcanic islands of the Tigrans and secure it for Colonial's army crossing. Additionally, dozens of transport barges moved out as well, to move all of the soldiers at once. This would not be a small-scale operation, not with the scale of the threat that awaited Metzacans on the other side. Every soldier in the army was sent out to fight, including newly trained musketeers, led by a group of experienced officers from old handgun companies, and even engineers. And amongst this new group, there was yet another addition, one that, at first, surprised many of the soldiers, who then welcomed it with open arms anyway. That addition was 200 priests of Azure Heart, members of religious order born in the Northern Empire in recent decades, who were now, for some unknown reason, moving en masse to the colonies. And though at first their contributions appeared questionable, mere few days after their arrival the priests became a vital part of the army. Not only they wielded magic that Mr. Storm identified as one extremely potent against the undead, and it worked so well that the mere presence of these priests in the camp made Galladay and her cohorts dizzy and uncoordinated, but what's more, the priests were also trained in arts of medicine, both regular and magical one, which meant that soldiers immediately accepted them into their ranks, knowing full well that these men would help Galladay patch them up should the worst come to pass. and the worst happened even before the army managed to load itself onto ships, as yet another message reached Metzacan forces, describing in great detail the undead horde that terrorized the island, and for most part the description remained the same, as vast majority of enemies were still ghosts and specters. But that would not make Colonial job any easier, for while the number of ghosts remained roughly the same, the number of undead dragons changed from 1 to 3. This single message made Arius sprout his first white hair, and for a good while he thought that it was some kind of twisted joke. But a quick recon mission across the strait with a bunch of drones only confirmed his worst fears. Somehow, within a year, the number of ghastly skeletal dragons increased, which meant that this operation, which was already considered dangerous before, now looked pretty much like a suicide mission. With that in mind, Arius addressed his men, telling them the truth and openly stating that if they were not willing to fight this fight, they could probably wait few additional months for resources and reinforcements. To Prince's surprise though, his men only scoffed and in a booming cheer decided to go through with the operation. After all, the soldiers said, if something killed those dragons once, then they could no doubt be felled again, although perhaps that confidence was born from the fact that no one saw an actual dragon in several centuries. Still, with his men backing him up, Arius gave an order to attack, and then withdrew himself to his cabin to prepare for battle. Several weeks later, the army reached shores of Tigran Island with a plan already prepared. The idea was to make a landfall, then move into the center of the island to link up with cat warriors and, hopefully, draw the undead into attacking their town, so that Metzacan army could use its fortifications for themselves. In order to do so, however, Colonial force would have to remain undetected, and so they chose a large patch of burned-out forest as their landing zone, hoping that it would conceal them during disembarking, for fighting during coastal landing would be the worst possible situation for them. And while first part of the operation worked out well, and Arius managed to bring all of his men ashore in peace, their move deeper into the mainland undetected failed mere few days later. For what Lord Governor and his officers failed to realize was that the forest might have offered them concealment, but the tangled, hardened web of ashen trees also severely reduced their mobility and made scouting ahead practically impossible. What's worse, while Metzacans tried to find their way in the labyrinth of dead trees, their foes could simply fly right above it, or, in case of specters, pass through it without trouble, and so as the army marched on ahead, they soon heard a thundering roar ahead of them, followed by a chorus of wailing screams. The soldiers instinctively huddled close to each other and raised their weapons, scanning the trees that, all of a sudden, started to look a lot more ominous than mere few minutes before. But despite that, the army marched on, and the priests of the heart led the way, chanting praises to their protector god, eager to test their convictions against undead hordes. And then, all hell broke loose. With a crackling sound, the trees in front of leading companies fell to the ground, tossed aside by 3 rotting undead beasts, each one standing almost 10 meters tall, with their wings making them seem even larger. With a deafening roar, they charged towards the leading soldiers, who raised their weapons and prepared to receive the attack. But then suddenly the beasts stopped and breathed a wave of noxious fumes at Colonial troops. Weapons melted and rusted on the spot, while the men fell to the ground unable to catch their breaths. Others began coughing so violently that bits of their lungs fell out from their choking mouths, making even screaming in pain impossible. All that Arius could have heard from his position in the middle of the line were roars of undead dragons, and then low, almost inaudible screech of his men, who desperately tried to remain on their feet. But, once again, the magical elementals proved to be saviors of the situation, for as soon as the dragons appeared, these magical beings charged on ahead, protected by Mr. Storm's magic, and took the brunt of the undead attack onto themselves, for without it, the entire flank would have collapsed right there and then. But even with that help, soldiers who formed that part of the formation mostly militia handgunners, some engineers and priests of the heart, were still in a grave danger, and so Arius gave a signal for them to retreat and link up with the main army so that they could deal with the dragons together, especially since the horde of wailing spectres was already spotted in amongst the trees, making their way towards Colonial forces. But in that moment, the forest itself proved to be more of a curse than a blessing, for as dragons rushed through it, the shockwave generated by their wings collapsed hundreds of trees around them, cutting off escape routes to the main army. Upon seeing that, even veterans of Metzacan militia started to panic, but in that very moment they were passed by a group of bloodied, coughing priests of Azure Heart, who rushed towards the undead monsters, but not to attack them. Instead, they poured all of their magical force into the elementals, mending their wounds, while at the same time shouting at the rest of the soldiers to rally around the magical beasts. For, at this point, they were the only hope of survival, or at the very least of holding on long enough for the rest of the army to arrive and help them. And so the soldiers were broke out from their panic mere seconds before the entire flank collapsed, left there dying on the ground where they still coughed and vomited their life away, and rushed towards the priests, raising their weapons and firing a wild barrage of gunfire at the dragons, although at this point, with so many dead and wounded, it was much less effective than it could have been. What's worse, some of the priests who kept patching up the wounded saw through the maze of trees that the main force was not actually moving in to help them. Instead, they followed the original plan and backed off towards several clearings that the army has passed some time ago, hoping to establish a defensive position there. Upon seeing that, the priests realized that the prince decided to leave them to buy the rest of the army time to reach better positions, and so now they could only try and delay their undead foes, and die in the process, or abandon their wounded comrades and try to run away. But if there is one thing that Azure Heart approves of, it is selfless sacrifice, and so the priests kept their new knowledge to themselves, and once more rallied nearby soldiers, hoping to inspire them to fight on. But as they did so, the sky above them suddenly became even darker than before, and an ominous red cloud appeared right above them, which then shattered into thousands of little fragments that crushed into every single one of Metzacan soldiers. And although at first it seemed that nothing has happened, back in the center of the army, Prince Arius shook his head and told his men to not worry. This was all part of his last-minute plan, something that could not only save many lives, but also ensure that all the losses they took were not in vain. Metzacan army, he said, would fight on, no matter what. Galadea, please tell me you're joking. Please, for all that is good under these stars, tell me that you have not done this thing to my men without telling either me or them beforehand. If they realized what happened to them, they will all thank you for thinking ahead and creating contingency plans for worst eventualities, my prince. I hope that I will not be forced to use said contingency, but you are not going to fight just some random group of bandits. I don't even know if all my knowledge will be enough to protect you out there, not to mention the rest of the army. But since you're committed, then I have to do this. I understand, and I appreciate your concern, but turning our own soldiers into undead just to win a battle is not something that can be done without telling them first. They at least deserve a word of warning before we do this to them. And do you think they would march into battle then, knowing all that? No. They would resent you. They would think that you merely wish to use them as bait or sacrifice. Besides, as I said, let's hope it won't come to this. If anyone stand a chance to walk out of such a battle unscathed, it's your army, my prince. And if we are forced to use this backup, then at least it will ensure survival of at least some of us, which I'm sure is preferable to total annihilation of entire army, don't you think? Especially since some soldiers in said army actually helped me figure out this little trick, although Mr. Rifleman was not exactly aware of that at the time. And now you're experimenting on our soldiers behind my back. If the Council hears about this... Council, it's always the bloody Council. I have told you already that Metzaca does not need them, and neither do you. If anything, they're holding all of us back all the time. No, do not try to defend them. Do not try to tell me that they have their merits. Let me remind you that before you arrived, all they did was sit in their cozy mansions while all around them the island was falling to pieces. Hell, they were not even aware or interested that some of their settlements seceded or were taken over by monsters. But then you arrived, and yes, you could have done the same. Just use your position to live your remaining days in comfortable stagnation. But you chose otherwise. You were the one who took the garrison outside and brought order and peace to your holdings. You led the army who opened trade routes, and you led expeditions that brought even more money and trade back to the city, while the councillors just continued to sit, bicker, and complain all the time. It has to stop. You can't be their errand boy for all time, Arius. You are a son of a king, but instead of acting like one, you're like this shy child who tries to please everybody, and while it may seem admirable at first, it makes all those corrupt, greedy bastards use you for their own needs. As I said, you are royalty, so start acting like it. You know, it's hard to even call me nobility. My father was a commoner before they crowned him. And what does it matter? Do you think that kings should have their titles solely because of their birth? Or maybe they should gain such title thanks to their own skills and perseverance? The second one, of course, but I still don't think I'll be good monarch material. Then go out into the camp, or into the streets once we're back in Metzaca, and ask people what they think. Not jumped-up lesser nobles who think they're the center of the world, but regular people, those who actually make this country of yours work. And as for your soldiers, I honestly can't believe that you can't see the adoration in their eyes whenever you pass by. Think on it for a second. You have told them that you're about to go into battle against ancient, deadly monstrosities that were thought to have been exterminated almost a millennium ago. Beasts that were known to decimate entire armies. Then you added that they are undead and that there's 3 of them. And tell me, have you heard any word of complaint from your soldiers? Have you heard of even a single person that would like to run away? Not really. If anything, the men seem to be in oddly high spirits. People are already betting on who will land the killing blow on these monsters. Exactly, and it is all thanks to your command. These men, especially those who lived here before your arrival, were not that long ago completely hopeless. They sat in their city, hungry and furious, while the world around them was a deadly mystery. But then you came along and led them on a conquering spree. You gave them pride and, more importantly, something to fight for, which is why they trust you. And you have done a splendid job at that. To be honest, every time I see you in battle, I feel like I'm looking at someone else. All indecisiveness vanishes, replaced by steely resolve and, at least as far as I can tell, very good sense of tactics and strategy. And you don't just sit back. I saw you throwing yourself at extremely dangerous foes to get your men out of danger, and they appreciate it more than you know. And out of the field, you walk all the time as well. And not just for yourself, but for them too. At this point, I'm reasonably sure they would do anything for you, including going through with that plan of mine. Let's hope so, because if we're forced to use it, then we'll both have a lot of explaining to do. Blame it all on me, I can take it. Not to mention that I'm sure I could talk your boys and girls that it was a perfect idea within a minute, as long as I have some drinks on hand. I'll tell the captain to get some barrels of the good stuff ready. I just hope we won't regret this. But that's enough talk, we all have preparations to deal with for the fight, so I hope you kept your scythe sharp. It's always sharp for you, my prince, but I will not be joining you this time. This ritual I have planned will keep both me and all of my assistants busy. We've never tried something on such a large scale before, after all. I see. It's not ideal, though. I have grown to rely on your skills quite a lot in recent years. Ah, thank you for your praise, my prince. I will treasure these words always and forever, but believe me, this is for the best. So it would seem. Very well then, Miss Pireni. I'll see you soon. Of course you will. Still, do be careful out there. We can't afford to lose you. Yes, we still need to find that city of immortals. That too. But more than that, well, it would be very boring around here without someone fun to talk to. The red cloud vanished as suddenly as it appeared, but while soldiers in the back lines were unnerved by it, this phenomenon was mostly ignored as it seemed to have no visible effect, not to mention that soldiers at the front were far more busy simply trying to stay alive. On the right, Metzacan swordsmen, Wolven Guards and Knights of the Trident took position in a large clearing and prepared to launch a flanking maneuver, knowing full well that with priests being occupied on the left, it would fall to them to deal with the horde of ghostly apparitions. On the left, both men and magical beasts fought on side by side, with priests standing in the middle, rallying them to fight even harder, while patching up wounded who could no longer stand. But now that dragons spent their fuming breaths, they simply charged in as well, slashing wildly at Metzacan soldiers with their claws and fangs, forcing militiamen to fall back and giving them almost no chance to reload their guns. That chance, however, was not yet lost, as Frost Elementals continued to hold on like an anchor, stabilizing that entire part of the field, while at the same time Metzacan engineers, for most of which this was their very first combat experience, bravely held their ground, bombarding approaching beasts with blinding grenades, although even that temporary confusion did not make their attacks any less deadly. Even worse, the massive bone construct arrived as well, like a grotesque, enormous crab, and started flailing its bony appendages around, smashing aside anyone standing in its way. Within mere moments, most of the men on that flank were either dead or dying, but then, as everything seemed lost, some of the fallen ones suddenly started to stir. Their unseeing eyes opened yet again, and, with an otherworldly groan, the dead soldiers began to rise up, despite their wounds. Even those slashed into pieces or crushed into a gory mess started to move, and as soon as they could stand up, they threw themselves mindlessly at the dragons once again, raising one last war cry that echoed across the forest like a call of some ancient, vengeful beast. The few of their remaining comrades who were still alive stared at this scene in utter confusion, seeing bodies with no heads or broken limbs flailing their weapons with wild abandon. Those corpses who could not stand up reached out for their handguns and began firing once again, even as their own blood started to clog their firearms. The dragons and Bone Machine, however, did not care, and while such a display would no doubt terrify any living army, the beasts simply resumed their rampage. But for every shambler they killed, another would soon rise up and just throw itself at them, if not in hopes of killing them, then at least to slow them down. And it worked. From behind the tangled mess of fallen trees, Metzacan artillery could finally launch its first barrage, flinging stones that broke the undead dragons apart, leaving gaping holes in their decaying bodies, although even that was not nearly enough to finish them off. For the Drakes, despite starting to fall apart, continued their relentless attack without pause, and what's worse, now that most of the soldiers on the flank were gone, they could simply cleave through the walking corpses, leave elementals behind, and focus their attention on the main army, which is exactly what they did. Soon, the backlines saw the very same thing their fallen comrades witnessed few minutes before, as massive, undead beasts flew low above the ashen trees, unhinged their maws, and spewed forth a cloud of poisonous fumes, engulfing hundreds of men in a single attack. But there was nothing else that Metzacans could do. The forest around them was so dense and their formation so crowded that the men could not retreat or spread out, and so, spurred on by Arius, who barely managed to avoid Noxious Cloud himself, launched a counterattack, hoping that the Drakes were sufficiently weakened by their fallen comrades, who continued to rise up from their eternal rest all around the field, and even managed to wipe out the construct by simply flooding it with their own bodies and bullets. The elementals kept on fighting as well, still holding their own even as first wraiths started to arrive and attack them with their ethereal hands. But, as before, they could not remain ethereal forever, and every time they launched an attack they had to materialize, which gave those magical creatures and Metzacan soldiers a chance to take them down. Still, the fight was far from over. The priests managed to take down a lot of spectres that floated towards the main army, but with every passing moment they found themselves more and more surrounded, without any means of fleeing back to the main force. And so, instead of doing that, they simply decided to hold their ground and formed a circle amongst the trees, singing hymns to their protector god and launching barrages of magical bolts at any undead who dared to come closer. And while this move was nothing more but a last suicidal show of defiance, it gave Colonial soldiers on the right a chance to spring their ambush and charge directly into the flank of approaching spectres, although their attack, not backed by magical support, proved to be a lot less effective than they hoped. Still, Arius's men charged into the fray anyway, and as they did so, the main line suddenly erupted with cheers of the living soldiers, as one of the dragons finally fell to the ground, riddled full of musket rounds and arrows, while another one started to slowly fall apart under constant attacks as well. Soon, Mr. Storm rushed in to help as well, shouting at Arius to remain as far away from the beast as he could, and then fired his own electrifying attack at the beast, grabbing its attention and allowing Continental spearmen to move in and, with hundreds of quick jabs, finally finish it off. For a second, the retinues cheered, raising their gilded spears and shields high, but in that very moment the drake at their feet suddenly moved again, sending the entire company running away in a mindless panic, and even though Arius's men tried to stop them and explain that it was just the last final twitch of this long-dead monstrosity, they kept on running until the noise of the battle could no longer be heard behind them. The last dragon, however, was still not done, and instead of fighting another mass of constantly raising undead, it too flew above the trees and caught almost entire center of the army in its noxious cloud, felling almost 200 men with this very single attack. What's more, this time Mr. Storm himself was not fast enough to avoid it as well, and now he and his few remaining retainers barely managed to hold themselves in their saddles, coughing and spitting, while all around them both fresh recruits and veteran soldiers dropped to the ground like flies. But mere moments later they started to rise up once again, their bloody, pale eyes focused on the beast that brought their demise. It was time for the last effort, but as the main formation attacked the last remaining dragon with everything they had, the remaining handful of priests vanished beneath a tide of spectral bodies, and their chant to Azure Hearts was finally silenced. And yet, their sacrifice was enough. As the wraiths were focused on them, the remnants of Colonial army fired every single musket and bow at the dragon, until finally Prince Arius and his own cavalry formation arrived, dismounted as quickly as they could, and fired their light cannons at the beast, tearing off its head in this final devastating barrage. As the monster fell though, there were no cheers, not while the din of battle could still be heard from beyond the trees, while flanking force led by the knights kept on slashing their way through ghosts, while taking much higher casualties than they expected. At this point though, dealing with remaining spectres was only a matter of time, and even as the fight still went on, Arius and Mr. Storm sent a runner back to camp, with orders to rouse every available healer they could still find, while another messenger was sent to reach Tigran settlement and ask for any medical support they could provide as well, as some of the fallen soldiers could still be saved if the poison was expelled from their bodies with haste. And as these runners rushed off, the sound of battle finally stopped, replaced by dreadful silence. There were no cheers, no celebrations, not even screaming and wailing of the wounded. The field, covered in dead bodies and poisoned wounded, looked like a scene from a nightmare, illuminated in dark red glow of the sun that could only barely pierce through clouds of ash in the air. The soldiers, both rookies and veterans alike, stared at it in grim confusion, while some of the still moving corpses of their fallen comrades finally stopped moving and dropped to the ground one final time, where ash constantly falling from the sky already started to cover them with a heavy black blanket. Colonial army was victorious, but as Arius looked into faces of his soldiers, he could not see even a tiny bit of elation that they showed after previous fights. It was clear that the survivors were surprised to even be alive after this fight, but after seeing so many of their friends dying, then raising only to fall again and again, no one was in the mood to celebrate that survival. Not to mention that raising undead without asking for their consent beforehand was still considered to be extremely questionable practice, though it was undeniable that it brought results this time. And so, as battered Metzacans returned to their camp to drink their wounds and sorrows away, amidst screams of their wounded comrades, many soldiers shot grim glances at the Lord Governor. Sure, he delivered them to victory in the end, but a few more victories like that, and there would be no army left to go home. But as Colonial soldiers would soon learn, their work was far from over. As was said, there was always more to be done on this wild archipelago, and Tigran Island was no different. Over the course of past few years, ever since the undead started to appear in large groups, the cat people were forced to fall back to their hidden settlement deep inland and abandon their outer towns and villages, which were soon overrun by either beasts or opportunistic brigands or scavengers, or, even in one case, by a group of mercenaries hired by Crimson Star Company. Which meant that while Tigrans could finally leave their town in larger groups, they were severely weakened by lack of supplies and food, and so, while they could probably try and retake their lost settlements alone, it would no doubt take them very long time. So instead, Arius decided to help them with that endeavor as well, not just to secure even better relations with already grateful refugees, but also to ensure that more wealth would flow back to the main island. With that in mind, Lord Governor gave his men a few days to rest and then prepare to march out again, although with his force much smaller than just a few weeks ago. Some of the soldiers with lighter wounds decided to stay, but the majority of those who suffered in previous combat were sent back to the Cliff City, where they could rest and get back on their feet in the newly opened hospital. Yet another proof of Metzacan march into modern age, as unreliable magical healers and alchemists were slowly being replaced by professionals with verifiable training in actual medicine. And together with the wounded, the dead were sent back as well, at least those who were still in any shape to be transported back home without spilling overboard. The rest of the fallen, however, were burned in a single somber ceremony, and their souls were sent back to the stars to begin their life anew under some different sun on a different world. All of that happened, though, with one person being mostly absent. Namely Galadea, who was also not present during the battle itself. She returned shortly afterwards and reported back to Arius, but after leaving his command tent she retreated back to her own, out-of-the-way section of the camp with an oddly serious and determined expression on her face. Not that anyone dared to ask her why, especially since rumors about that mass reanimation during the battle was her doing already started to circulate amongst the soldiers. Still, Galadea would not just sit idly. Instead, she rounded up her hooded, faceless followers and got them to pick corpses of undead dragons apart, so that she could study them, not to mention that certain parts of these massive bodies could surely be sold to various collectors for nice profit. And so, when the army marched out again, they were accompanied by several carts full of dragon bones, with 3 great horned skulls staring ominously at anyone who passed by. But as they linked up with some of the Tigran cavalry, cats riding even larger cats, which made quite a lot of people scratch their heads in confusion, to deal with kobold infestation in one of the mines, the army received some news from home, using one of Arcadian's many machines. Apparently, some of his scout drones sent to outer islands were lost, which meant that entire exploration project to the south had to be put on hold. But the group sent to the north not only found the end of Frostlands, they also uncovered something far more interesting. This seemingly wild and untamed archipelago turned out to be a lot more crowded than Metzacans believed. Some continental nations started to take interest in the area, and so great fleets were spotted moving deeper into the islands to establish new settlements and spread influence of their mainland overlords. And the greatest of these fleets, of course, sailed under dark, crimson sails. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another board meeting. I apologize for inviting you to conduct business so suddenly, but in light of recent events and newfound knowledge, I'd say we should all focus our attention on crucial matters without wasting time.
You mean the archipelago, right? Or, to be more precise, you mean that you finally realized that we wasted years without securing a dominant position there, simply because you and your colleagues deemed the place to be worthless?
I admit that our operations there are not as expansive as they could have been, true, but I stand by my previous decisions, and second-guessing ourselves will not help seal our current deals any quicker, so let us get to business, shall we? As you know, the archipelago to the southwest has proven to be a lot richer than our first expedition suggested. It is true that these islands are dangerous, but the wealth that can be found there more than justifies the cost, especially now that we have learned about certain interesting qualities of that area. However, our current expansion in that direction suffered several setbacks due to mistakes committed by one of our board members, which almost dragged us into an open colonial conflict.
Do not try to lay blame poorly on Mr. Garrick. You know just as well as the rest of us that the board has voted unanimously to give him rights to procure Tigrans in bulk. You are just as responsible for it as Kelrick and the rest of us are.
Not quite, I'm afraid. Yes, we have given Mr. Gelrick clearance to procure said merchandise, but we also gave him strict orders to keep it untraceable. We can't allow the company to be found in the middle of trafficking intelligent beings, can we?
True enough, but why in star's name are we even doing this? Considering who the buyers are, outrage is to be expected. If anything, we should just cut all our ties with that group. They are not worth the hassle.
On the contrary, conducting business with them is far more profitable than with any continental nation. And besides, Imperials do know the value of secrecy. Why do you think they keep their borders closed and only let a bunch of indoctrinated pirates or brigands or religious fanatics outside of their nation? So, not only no one will be able to track the Tigrans all the way to the Empire, even if someone would find out, there is nothing to do, as no one is insane enough to go fight the most powerful nation in the world. So, do not worry about that. We'll keep doing business with them as long as it's profitable, and then we'll cut ties, as is our way. But that's all beside the point right now. Mr. Gelrick placed us in a problematic situation, but fortunately our operative in the archipelago managed to resolve the situation surprisingly well.
Well? You call throwing fellow board members to the wolves well? You call losing Dolvesmere to those erratic fools from Metzaca well? Are we living in the same reality?
We are. Again, Mr. Gelrick brought this upon himself, and Mr. Carrodus simply understood that in order to avoid open conflict, he would have to offer that princeling from Southern something that appeared valuable. And what could be more valuable than one of the highest-ranking members of the company? As for Dolvesmere, though, it was more of a move to secure future good relations, both with Metzaca and Tigrans themselves, especially now since those cats seem to have thrown their lot in with Southern refugees. And more to the point, thanks to Mr. Carrodus' gesture, we still have means of procuring interesting Tigran specimens for our clients, and this time there is no trail leading back to us. And then, finally, establishing companies present in Metzaca allowed us to benefit from their own prosperity. I agree that handing over Dolvesmere was not optimal, but by now we already have other ports in the area, ones a lot less conspicuous and far better suited to our needs. We have lost some profits, but made up a lot more, so overall I'd say Mr. Carrodus proved himself rather well, don't you think? Which is why I'd like to recommend him to be named as Governor of the Charter to replace poor Mr. Gelrick.
Are you out of your mind? You want to trust Carrodus, of all people, to represent us in such a strategically important area, even though you know full well about his family issues?
Do not put words in my mouth. I do not trust Mr. Carrodus even slightly, and I won't even after his body is burnt to ash and his soul sent to the stars. But he is a good man for the job at hand. Yes, his underground legacy is well known, but here it can very well work in our favor. According to reports of our other operatives, the archipelago is not really a place for large, organized armies, not for now at least, which is why Mr. Carrodus and his shady friends should perform nicely there, as they will be able to move around quickly and without leaving traces. The company will do what needs to be done, but our hands will remain clean. So, what does the board say? Are we in favor? Good. Very good. I will prepare the message as soon as possible, but in the meantime we have more things to discuss.
Indeed we do. Losing the Artificer to Metzacans will impact our other projects, I'm afraid.
Indeed it will. It was amazingly bad luck to have young Erigen walk right into his friend in Dorsmere, but what's done is done. We already have agents working in his factories, so I'd say it's only a matter of time before he will start working for us, and even better, he will do so without being aware.
I see. Ranulph really does think about everything, doesn't he? Still, I hope that this attitude will help him deal with another colonial problem. Our friends, from what I can tell, are becoming a bit rowdy.
As was expected of them, but that is actually almost completely inconsequential at this point. Let's just say that we just have to only whisper a single sentence in the proper ear, and Mr. Erigen will deal with the issue for us. He may even thank us for bringing it to him.